There is a moment in every war when the fighting continues, but the believing stops. Not the believing in orders, not the believing in commands shouted from officers crouching behind Rubel, or directives transmitted through crackling radio sets deep inside frozen bunkers. Those things kept going. The machinery of war kept grinding, but something else, something quieter, something essential, went dark. The belief that any of it meant something. The belief that the end of the road would look different from where they were standing right now. That belief. That fragile, irreplaceable thing that makes a man pick up a rifle and walk toward enemy fire and not simply fall down and refuse. That died long before the guns did. And what I'm going to tell you today is something the history books skim over. Something that documentaries cut away from too quickly. Something the official histories of the Second World War have never been entirely comfortable saying out loud. A massive number of German soldiers knew the war was lost as early as 1943, and they kept fighting anyway. Not because they believed in Hitler, not because they believed in the Reich, not because propaganda had successfully maintained their will, but for reasons far more human, far more complicated, and far more haunting than any of that. They fought because of the man beside them. They fought because surrender meant death or Siberia. They fought because going home, if home still existed, required surviving what was in front of them right now. They fought because the alternative to fighting was a kind of psychological disintegration that the human mind will do almost anything to avoid. This is not a story about fanaticism. This is not a story about monsters. It is a story about what happens to ordinary human beings when the cause collapses beneath their feet and the war keeps going anyway. It is a story about the psychological machinery of a losing army. How it works, how it breaks, how it holds itself together with fraying rope and desperate silence. It is a story that has never been told quite this way before, and it deserves to be told, because it is one of the most profoundly human and profoundly disturbing stories that the Second World War produced. Stay with me, because before this is over, you are going to understand something about war, and about people that most people never confront. And if that kind of deep, honest, uncomfortable history is what you're here for, hit subscribe now, because I'm going to keep going into these corners that the textbooks won't touch. I want to start with a date that doesn't get enough attention. February 2nd, 1943. You know what happened at Stalingrad? The encirclement, the brutal winter, the slow annihilation of the Sixth Army. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendering in the basement of a department store on Gogol Street, his hands trembling, his uniform hanging from a body that had wasted through months of siege. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers trapped and destroyed. It is one of the most catastrophic military defeats in modern history, and everyone knows it. But what everyone doesn't quite reckon with is what it did to the men who weren't there. The men who were in France, in North Africa, in Greece, in Norway, in the vast frozen emptiness of occupied Russia somewhere west of the cauldron. The men who heard the news on their radio sets or read it in the army newspapers, scrubbed of the worst details, papered over with propaganda about heroic sacrifice and dying for the fatherland. And Wu felt something shift inside them that never quite shifted back. Letters from that period are remarkable documents. They have been collected by historians, preserved in archives, studied by researchers at the Deutsche Dienst, catalogued by scholars like Michael Burley and Omer Barthoff and Klaus Jürgen Müller, who spent careers trying to understand what the Wehrmacht was actually thinking in those years. And what those letters reveal, once you read them carefully, once you learn to decode the circumlocutions forced on soldiers by military censorship, is a sudden, sharp change in register. A change in tone, a change in what men were willing to write home about. A change, more fundamentally, in what they were willing to let themselves think. Before Stalingrad, the letters are complicated. There is ideological content in some of them, not universal, not uniform, but present. There is a confidence, however strained, that the enterprise has forward momentum. There are men writing about what they'll do when they get back, about the future in specific terms, about plans that assume a German victory as the underlying condition. There are complaints, there are always complaints in soldiers' letters, about the food, about the cold, about officers, about boredom, about the mud that seems to define every theater of every war that has ever been fought. But beneath the complaint, there is a kind of orientation, a direction, a sense that there is somewhere this is all going. After Stalingrad, that changes. The letters don't suddenly become seditious. They don't suddenly fill up with denunciations of Hitler or calls for peace or demands that somebody stop the madness. The military censors, were reading everything, and the soldiers knew it, and the consequences of writing the wrong thing were severe. Men had been arrested, court-martialed, shot for less. But even through the careful language, even through the deliberate vagueness about military matters, something has gone. A frequency has dropped out of the signal. Men who used to write about the future now write almost exclusively about the present. Men who used to sign off with formulations about victory now sign off with formulations about survival. Men who used to project confidence now project It is not a small change. It is a fundamental reorientation of psychological posture, visible across thousands of letters, across multiple theaters, across different units and social classes and levels of ideological commitment. They knew. Not all of them. Not immediately. Not uniformly. The Wehrmacht was not a single organism with a single mind, a soldier who had just crawled out of the Demiansk pocket, who had watched his unit reduced to a fraction of its original strength over months of brutal fighting, who had carried his dead friends to shallow graves in frozen earth. That man's experience was radically different from the experience of a soldier in a re-echelon logistics unit somewhere comfortable in France, living in a requisitioned farmhouse and eating off actual plates. The knowledge of impending defeat did not arrive simultaneously or uniformly across 3 million men deployed across a continent, but it spread. It moved through the army like groundwater, invisible on the surface, but saturating everything beneath. And the question that I think is genuinely worth asking, the question that gets at something real about the human condition under these circumstances, is, what did they do with it? What do you do when you know, in some unignorable corner of your mind, that the thing you are risking your life for every single day has already effectively failed? What do you do with that knowledge? How do you get up in the morning? How do you obey orders? How do you load your rifle and move through the mud toward the enemy when the part of your brain that assesses situations and calculates odds has quietly concluded that the conclusion is foregone? I'm going to tell you exactly what they did with it, and the answers are going to surprise you. The first thing they did, the first and most fundamental psychological adaptation, was compartmentalization. And I don't mean that in a vague pop psychology sense. I mean something very specific and very observable: the deliberate and disciplined separation of the large strategic picture from the immediate tactical reality. The war as a whole, that was one category. The patrol you're going on tonight, that was another. And the psychological survival strategy was to make those two categories as airtight as possible, to refuse, at a deep level, to allow the large failure to contaminate the immediate task. This is actually a very human mechanism. It is something that human beings do in extremity across many different contexts. A doctor in a failing hospital makes rounds. A teacher in a failing school teaches. A parent in a failing marriage gets the children ready for school. The ability to continue performing immediate functions while holding large-scale failure at arm's length is not a pathology. It is, in many respects, adaptive. It is what allows functioning to continue when functioning would otherwise be impossible. But it is particularly visible and particularly well documented in the Wehrmacht, because the Wehrmacht situation was so extreme for so long, and because the documentation, the letters, the diaries, the postwar testimonies, the unit histories, the captured German army records that fill archives in Washington and Moscow and Freiburg is so extensive. You can actually watch this mechanism operating in real time as you read through the sources. You can trace it as it develops, intensifies, strains, and in some cases, breaks. A soldier named Hans K., whose letters are preserved in the Bund, writes home to his wife in January 1944, a year in which the Eastern Front has continued its grinding, bloody retreat, a year in which the objective situation of Germany in this war has continued to worsen at every level of analysis. He writes, "We no longer speak of what will happen after. We speak of what is in front of us. The forest to the east of us has been cleared. The road to the village is secure. Today, that is enough. That is a man who has made a decision, a man who has looked at the large picture and decided that he cannot afford to look at the large picture, a man who has constructed a psychological perimeter around the immediate, the forest, the road, the village, because that is the only territory he can control, the only territory where his effort still connects to an outcome, the only territory where agency remains even slightly possible. This is not stupidity. This is not the absence of awareness. This is actually a form of sophisticated psychological self-management under conditions of extreme stress, and it is widespread. You find it in letter after letter, diary after diary, testimony after testimony, across the entire remaining course of the war. The retreat from the strategic to the immediate, the narrowing of the horizon to what is right in front of you, because what is right in front of you can still be handled. What is right in front of you still admits of the possibility of competence, of craft, of the application of skill and training and courage and experience, the war as a whole that has slipped beyond any individual soldier's reach. But the firefight at this crossroads, the defense of this farmhouse, the withdrawal across this river, those are still problems that a trained soldier can engage with, and engaging with them is the only way to maintain any sense of agency at all. There is a psychological concept here that is worth naming, because it illuminates something important: locus of control. The degree to which a person believes that outcomes are within their own control versus determined by external forces, and decades of research across multiple disciplines, from occupational psychology to studies of trauma survivors to the social science of soldiers in combat, has consistently found that human beings fare better psychologically when they maintain a sense of internal control, when they believe that what they do has an effect on what happens to them, when agency is available, however limited. The Wehrmacht soldier who retreated from the strategic to the immediate was, functionally, preserving his internal locus of control in the only domain where preserving it was still possible. The war as a whole was beyond his control. The next 3 hours. What he did, how he moved, how he led his men, whether he made the right call at the right moment, that was not beyond his control. That was what kept him functional. That was what kept him moving through the mud. But here's the thing about compartmentalization. And here's where it starts to become something more disturbing than simply a coping mechanism. It enables continued performance. A man who has successfully separated his awareness of strategic defeat from his engagement with tactical reality can still be a very effective soldier. He can still shoot accurately, move efficiently, follow orders, maintain discipline, hold his position under fire, read terrain, manage his equipment, take care of the men in his unit. The psychological mechanism that allows him to survive the contradiction between knowing and continuing also allows the war machine to continue functioning long after its rational justification has evaporated. This is one of the central moral complexities of the Wehrmacht's behavior in the war's final years, and it is one that historians have wrestled with extensively and honestly. The soldiers were not simply robots following orders. They were not simply fanatics driven by ideology. They were human beings who had found ways to keep functioning in a situation that should, by any rational assessment, have produced mass breakdown and mass refusal. And the mechanisms they used to keep functioning, however understandable, however human, also served to extend the war, to extend the killing, to extend the suffering of everyone who was in the path of that war machine. There is no comfortable way to sit with that. There is no resolution that makes everyone feel better about it. It is simply what happened, and it deserves to be understood in its full complexity. Now, I want to talk about something specific, something that the historical record is very clear about, even though it often gets lost in more general accounts of the war's final years. I want to talk about the role of the small unit, Kameradschaft, the comradeship of the immediate squad or platoon, in sustaining combat performance after the ideological justification had collapsed. Because this is where the story gets genuinely remarkable. One of the major debates in the historiography of the Wehrmacht, the body of historical scholarship about the German armed forces in the Second World War, has been the question of what motivated soldiers to keep fighting. For a long time, the dominant explanation was ideology. The argument, associated particularly with the historian Omer was that the Wehrmacht was a deeply ideologized force that Nazi ideology penetrated down to the level of the individual soldier, that the soldiers fought not just for Germany, but for specifically Nazi Germany, and that understanding their motivation requires taking seriously the degree to which they had internalized the ideological framework of the regime. Bartov pointed to the Wehrmacht's participation in the ideological war of extermination on the Eastern Front, to the degree to which Nazi racial categories shaped the army's conduct in occupied territories, and to the evidence that many soldiers were genuinely committed to the vision of a race-ordered Europe that the Nazi regime was attempting to establish. Bartov's work, especially his books Hitler's Army and the Eastern Front, is genuinely important. He is right that ideology matters, that it cannot be dismissed, that the post-war effort by former Wehrmacht soldiers and officers to present the army as a professional force untouched by Nazi ideology is a fiction. That is all true, and it has been compellingly demonstrated. But more recent scholarship, and here I want to point to the work that extends and in some ways revises, but drawing on an older foundation laid by Edward Schills and Maurice Young, points to something different as the primary driver of combat cohesion in the war's later years. Not ideology, not political belief, not commitment to the Nazi cause, but primary group cohesion, the bond between individual soldiers in the same small unit, the loyalty to the man on your left and the man on your right. The unwillingness to let your comrades down, the commitment to reciprocal obligation within the immediate group of people you have lived alongside, fought alongside, suffered alongside. Schills and Janowitz published their analysis in 1948, drawing on interviews with German prisoners of war and analysis of captured German documents. Their conclusion was that the Wehrmacht maintained its cohesion and effectiveness through most of the war, primarily because of the strength of primary group bonds within small units, and that the collapse of those bonds when EAT came was the most reliable predictor of unit disintegration. Their methodology has been criticized and refined in the decades since, but the core finding that primary group loyalty, not ideological commitment, was the dominant driver of German combat effectiveness has proven remarkably durable. It has been confirmed, refined, and extended by subsequent researchers working with broader and better documentation than Schills and Janowitz had access to. This is a profoundly human finding, and it is also, in its implications, a profoundly disturbing one. Because what it means is that the Wehrmacht's combat effectiveness in the war's final years, the effectiveness that cost millions of lives, that prolonged the conflict, that allowed the war machine to grind on for 2 full years past the point where any reasonable observer could see how it would end, was sustained not primarily by the power of Nazi ideology, but by something much more universal, by something that we recognize from every context in which human beings have ever been placed in danger together. The bonds between soldiers, the mutual obligation that forms between people who depend on each other for survival, the loyalty that has nothing to do with politics or ideology and everything to do with the specific, named, irreplaceable human beings who make up the world immediately around you. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Really sit with it, because it matters more than almost anything else. I'm going to say today, a German soldier in a foxhole on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1943 to 1944 knows, at some level, in the part of his mind he doesn't talk about, that Germany is losing the war. He knows that Stalingrad was a catastrophe. He has watched the front lines move steadily westward. He has done the mathematics of attrition that every soldier does. The informal, constant, almost unconscious calculation of casualties and reinforcements and equipment losses. That tells you whether your side is winning or losing, regardless of what the newspapers say. He knows that the Red Army is not the disorganized, subhuman force that the official picture had described. He has fought them. He knows what they are capable of. Knows. And he still goes out on the night patrol, not because he believes in Hitler, not because he is a committed National Socialist, not even because he is afraid of the military courts that shot deserters, though that fear is real and it matters. He goes out because his squad leader, a man he has known for 2 years, a man who covered him when his rifle jammed at the edge of a ravine outside Kharkov, a man whose children he has seen photographs of pinned inside the man's helmet, that man is going out on the patrol, and you do not leave that man out there alone. You do not allow the bond to be broken, not because of ideology, not because of politics, because of love. Because of the most human thing there is. The tragedy of this is very nearly unbearable when you really look at it. That the qualities which sustain the war, loyalty, love, the refusal to abandon the people who depend on you, are exactly the qualities that we would most want to find in human beings. And yet in this specific context, in this specific situation, those qualities are what extends the killing. That is the deepest and darkest irony of the war's final years. And it is one that no history I have read manages to confront with complete honesty. Now I want to move to something different, to the specific mechanisms through which the German military and political apparatus tried to manage the growing awareness of defeat. Because the leadership knew what the soldiers knew. They may not have admitted it to themselves in exactly those terms. Hitler's capacity for self-deception was vast and, in some respects, genuine, but at the level of the professional military staff, at the level of the intelligence services and the logistics planners and the operational commanders, there was a clear-eyed understanding that the war was not going to be won, and they tried to manage that understanding. They tried, with considerable ingenuity and considerable ruthlessness, to prevent the knowledge of impending defeat from translating into the kind of organized resistance or mass breakdown that would cause the front to collapse. The first mechanism was information control. The German military censorship apparatus was extensive and systematic. Every letter going home, every letter coming from home, was subject to inspection. Soldiers who wrote too explicitly about the military situation, who expressed doubt about victory, who described the true scale of the losses being suffered, those soldiers risked serious consequences. Not always, not uniformly, not with perfect consistency. The censorship apparatus was large and imperfect, and a great deal slipped through. The sheer volume of military mail, hundreds of thousands of letters per day at peak periods, meant that detailed examination of every item was impossible, and the censors developed systems for sampling and keyword flagging that were more efficient, but also more porous than complete reading would have been. But the threat was real, and it shaped what people wrote, which shaped what they allowed themselves to think, which shaped, however, imperfectly, what they talked about. The army newspapers, the various front-setting publications, the divisional newspapers, the official army journals, continued to project confidence throughout. They reported victories, however tactical, however limited. They framed retreats as strategic repositioning, as planned shortening of the front, as the deliberate creation of better defensive positions. They celebrated individual heroes, decorated soldiers whose stories could be told in terms of offensive valor, and avoided extended discussion of the overall strategic situation in terms that would allow any honest reader to calculate where things actually stood. The soldiers read them with the particular skepticism of people who have been lied to before and have learned to read between the lines, not ignorant of the manipulation, not entirely resistant to it either, because the manipulation was aimed at exactly the uncertainties and fears they were already experiencing. The second mechanism was what the Germans called Durchhalten, holding out, the ideology of persistence. The idea hammered home through every available channel. The radio, the newspapers, the speeches of officers, the pronouncements of political commissars attached to military units, the visual propaganda of the Wehrmacht art service, that endure in itself was heroic. That the willingness to continue was a form of victory regardless of the objective military situation. That history remembered those who held on, even when those who calculated had advised surrender. Frederick the Great appeared constantly in this propaganda as the example of the leader who had held on against impossible odds and prevailed. It was propaganda, of course, but it was sophisticated propaganda because it shifted the goalposts in a way that is psychologically clever. If winning is no longer available as a mental frame, survival becomes the frame. And survival is always at least theoretically available until the moment you are dead. So the soldier who can no longer believe in victory can sometimes, with enough ideological support, sustain himself on the idea of on the idea that his job is not to win, but to hold, not to advance, but to not break, not to achieve, but to persist. The third mechanism And this is the one that gets darkest. And that, I think, is genuinely important to understand. Was the explicit threat of violence against those who did not continue. The system of military justice in the Wehrmacht was severe at any point in the war, but it became dramatically more severe as the war turned. Summary executions of soldiers deemed to be deserting, or showing cowardice, or surrendering without authorization accelerated dramatically after the military courts, Decree Scherichte, issued death sentences at a rate that would have been almost unimaginable in the war's early years. By 1944 and 1945, German soldiers were being shot not just for desertion but for defeatism, for saying, in the hearing of others, that the war was lost, for expressing in words what many of them privately believed. The official euphemism was undermining military morale. Wehrkraft zur Sitzung, and it covered an enormous range of speech that in peacetime would have been unremarkable. Expressing doubt, questioning orders, predicting defeat, saying what the reality was. The numbers are staggering when you look at them. The Wehrmacht executed roughly 15,000 of its own soldiers during the Second World War for military offenses. The comparable figure for the United States military in the same war was fewer than 150. Comparable figure for the British military was fewer than 40. The disproportion is so extreme that it functions as its own kind of evidence about what was required to maintain the German military's cohesion, not the genuine agreement of the soldiers with the goals of the regime, but the ever-present awareness that the consequences of visible non-compliance were lethal. The Himmlerbefehl, the order from Heinrich Himmler, in his capacity as commander of the reserve army after the July 20, 1944 bomb plot, authorized the formation of mobile courts that could sentence soldiers on the spot. The flying courts, the Fliehenden, Standgericht, could and did execute soldiers for infractions that earlier in the war would have resulted in imprisonment or disciplinary duty. The message was clear, and it was delivered with the full force of the state's capacity for organized violence. The cost of expressing the knowledge that the war was lost was potentially your life. And so, you got a phenomenon that historians have noted, and that is psychologically fascinating in its ugliness. The performance of belief. Soldiers who did not believe performing the external markers of belief. Soldiers who had privately concluded that the war was over, maintaining, in their official behavior, in their speech, in their interactions with officers and party functionaries, the forms of confidence and commitment that the regime demanded, not because they had been deceived, not because they were fanatical, but because the alternative was a bullet. This is not just a historical curiosity. It speaks to something fundamental about the relationship between external pressure and internal states, about how systems of surveillance and punishment can sustain the appearance of cohesion long after the underlying reality of cohesion has dissolved. You can make people act as if they believe. You cannot make them believe. But for the purposes of keeping an army in the field, the performance may be almost as effective as the real thing for a while. For long enough. Let me give you a specific case. Let me put a face on this. Unteroffizier Helmut Voss, not his real name, but drawn from composite testimony and post-war interviews collected by the Institute für Zeitgeschichte in Munich, Serbed Grenadier Regiment on the Eastern Front from 1942 to 1945. He was not a Nazi by conviction. He had not joined the Nazi Party. He had joined the army because his cohort was called up, because the alternatives were severely limited, and because in 1942 the war had still carried the momentum of 3 years of victories and the institutional authority of a state that had not yet shown itself incapable of ultimate success. He was, by his own account and by the accounts of his comrades who survived, a competent and conscientious soldier. He cared about his men with a directness and specificity that the testimony consistently records. He was good at his job in the narrow, technical, tactical sense of the word good. By his own account, given in an interview conducted in 1960, 15 years after the war, when the immediate urgency of self-protection had receded and the distance of time allowed a degree of honesty, he had concluded, by the summer of 1943, that Germany would lose the war. He had reached this conclusion not through any dramatic single revelation, but through the accumulation of what he had seen and heard and calculated. The losses were not sustainable at the rate they were occurring. The replacements coming up from the training depots were worse than the men they replaced, younger, less trained, more frightened, less capable of the automatic professional response that combat survival requires. The equipment situation was deteriorating. Weapons that arrived at the front needed repair almost immediately. Supply chains were lengthening as the front moved, and logistics struggled to keep pace. And the Red Army was not the disorganized rabble that the official picture had promised and that the victories of 1941 and 1942 had seemed to confirm. It was getting better as the Wehrmacht was getting worse. He did not tell anyone this. He could not tell anyone this. He continued to lead his squad, to conduct his patrols, to perform the duties of his rank. He received decorations twice. He was promoted. Et survive. What kept him going? His own answer, given carefully and haltingly, with the self-awareness of a man who had spent 15 years trying to understand his own behavior, trying to make peace with it, or at least to comprehend it, is illuminating. He said, "I could not leave them. There were men in my squad who were 19 years old. They had come to me, specifically because I had been there a long time, because I knew how to keep people alive. If Prometa had gone, if I had in some way ceased to do my job, some of them would have died who would not have died otherwise." That was the calculation I made. Every day, that was the calculation. That is not ideology. That is not Nazism. That is something much older and much more durable than either of those things. That is the weight of responsibility for specific, named, known human beings. That is the bond that forms an extremity between people who have shared danger, who have kept each other alive, who have learned over months and years to read each other's silences and to trust each other's judgment in the dark, when judgment is the only thing standing between you and death. And understanding it, really understanding it, without either sentimentalizing it or using it to excuse what it enabled, is essential too. Understanding what the war's final years actually were. Now, I want to take you forward in time to 1944, and to the most significant single event in the war's Western theater after June 6, 1944. Because something important happens to the psychology of the German soldier in the wake of the Normandy landings, something that the historical record captures clearly, and that is worth examining in detail. The soldiers in France, the divisions manning the Atlantic Wall, the formations held in reserve, the panzer units waiting for deployment orders that were delayed by strategic miscalculation and by Hitler's insistence on holding the armor until the location of the main landing was confirmed. They had known, in the abstract, that the invasion was coming. Everyone knew it was coming. The question was when and where. The Atlantic Wall was real, enormous fortifications, millions of tons of concrete, vast fields of beach obstacles, gun positions, minefields. Rommel had worked himself nearly to collapse trying to improve its defensive depth in the months before the invasion. Many of the officers believed, with varying degrees of conviction, that it could hold. Some of them performed the belief because the alternative was career-ending or worse. And then June 6th happened, and the Atlantic Wall, for all its concrete and steel and engineering ingenuity, did not hold. The beach at Omaha was catastrophic for the Americans. Yes, the cost there was real and terrible. But even at Omaha, the Americans were assured by nightfall. At the other beaches, the breaches were faster. And within days it was clear that the Allies were ashore in strength, that they were not going to be pushed back into the sea, that the second front that German soldiers had feared since 1941, the nightmare strategic scenario that the professional officers had been calculating since the moment Germany attacked the Soviet Union, was now real and operational and moving inland. The effect on morale was significant. Letters from this period, and there are many, from soldiers writing from Normandy and from other theaters observing events in France, show something different from the compartmentalized stoicism of the Eastern Front veterans. There is, in some of them, a quality of shock, as if a conclusion that had been reached intellectually but not fully emotionally had suddenly become viscerally real. The war is, in fact, lost. Not theoretically. Actually, right now, the two-front war is here. A soldier named Werner F. writes from somewhere in Normandy in June 1944, his letter was never finished, was found with his effects, and was preserved in an archive. He writes, I have thought for a long time that we were not winning. Now I understand that we were already lost. There is a difference between these two things, and I feel it now, in my chest, in a way I did not feel it before. He does not finish the letter. We do not know why. He may have been killed. He may have been called away and never returned to it. But that fragment captures something real about the psychological trajectory of the summer of 1944. The gap between knowing in your head and knowing in your body. The moment when an intellectual conclusion becomes something physical, something that you carry in your chest. The German army in Normandy fought with a tenacity that surprised many Allied commanders who had expected a faster collapse. Not everywhere, not uniformly, there were breakdowns, surrenders, desertions, entire units that simply evaporated under the pressure of Allied firepower and the accumulating logic of an impossible position. But in many sectors, the resistance was fierce and sustained and tactically sophisticated, conducted by men who had understood for some time that the strategic situation was essentially hopeless. And the question is always the same question. Why? The answers converge on the same cluster of factors I've already described. Primary group cohesion, compartmentalization, the specific weight of particular responsibilities, but with something added in this theater that I think is important. By 1944, Allied bombing of Germany was well advanced. Hamburg had been firebombed in July 1943. T-Operation, Gomorrah raids creating a firestorm that killed between 35,000 and 45,000 people in a single week. Multiple major cities had been struck repeatedly. The soldiers in France had wives and parents and children and sisters in those cities. They had received letters describing the raids. Some of them had come home on leave and had seen the ruins. Some of them had not been able to go home on leave because there was no longer a home to go to. And the particular cruelty of their situation was that fighting on, not abandoning the field, not surrendering, not letting the Allied advance move unchecked, was the only thing they could do for those people. If Germany collapsed, the Soviets would come from the east. That outcome was, in the mind of most German soldiers, too terrible to contemplate. They knew what the Germans had done in the Soviet Union. They knew, at Somme-Labelle, that the Red Army was coming west with a memory and a fury that would make occupation something different from what occupation had been in France or Denmark. So you hold the line in Normandy not because you believe in Nazi victory, but because the alternative, the collapse, the occupation, the arrival of that army in your hometown, in the street where your wife and children live, is worse. You fight for the people you love. In a war, you know, is lost. Because the alternative to fighting is something you cannot allow yourself to imagine. There is a psychological trap embedded in this, and it is worth naming clearly. When the future you are fighting for is no longer believable, but the future you would be fighting toward by stopping is worse. You are trapped between an impossible objective and an intolerable alternative. You cannot advance toward victory because victory is no longer available. You cannot retreat toward surrender because the terms of surrender are too terrible to accept. You are pinned, and the only motion available to you is continued forward effort in the direction of an objective you no longer believe in. Not because you are irrational, not because ideology has rotted your capacity for clear thought, but because the logic of your situation, correctly calculated, produces exactly this outcome. Continue. This is rational. I want to be very precise about this, because it matters. The behavior of German soldiers in 1944 and 1945 is often characterized as irrational, as the behavior of men so captured by ideology or so damaged by years of combat that normal assessment had become impossible. Some of it was that there were genuinely fanatical soldiers, genuinely ideologically committed men, especially in the Waffen-SS formations and among certain officer groups that the regime had specifically selected and cultivated for ideological reliability. But for the average soldier of the Wehrmacht, the draftee, the conscript, the man who had been a factory worker or a farmer or a school teacher before the war called him up. The behavior was rational within a set of constraints that had been imposed by circumstances largely beyond his control. The logic was, I cannot stop without losing something worse than what I lose by continuing. Therefore, I continue. That is not Ideology. That is a man trying to solve an impossible problem with the only tools that remain available. Now, let me talk about something that happened within the German military that I think is crucial to understanding how knowledge of defeat was managed at the institutional level and how it eventually produced one of the most dramatic moments of the entire war. I want to talk about what the intelligence services knew, what the professional military staff knew, and what a small number of them ultimately decided to do about it. The German military intelligence services were producing assessments throughout the war. The Foreign Army's East Section, Fremde Heereshost, under General Reinhard Gehlen, was remarkable for the accuracy of its intelligence estimates about Soviet strength. Gehlen's analysts were producing assessments in 1942 and 1943 that predicted, with considerable accuracy, the scale of Soviet offensive capability and the likely shape of Soviet operations. These assessments were frequently dismissed by Hitler, who found them politically inconvenient and who had a long-established pattern of refusing information that contradicted his strategic preferences. But they existed. They were written down. They circulated written limits among the officer corps. The professional soldiers knew. The staff officers knew. The operations planners knew. They wrote their analysis, submitted them through channels, watched them be rejected or ignored, and continued doing their jobs. What does it do to a professional military man, a soldier with a lifetime of training in the careful assessment of military situations, a man whose professional identity is bound up in his ability to look at evidence and reach accurate conclusions, to write an honest analysis of Soviet strength, to calculate with professional precision that the Red Army is outproducing the Wehrmacht in every meaningful category, to conclude on the basis of all available evidence that Germany cannot win this war, and then to continue serving the regime that has rejected that analysis and is driving toward catastrophe. What does it do to your self-conception? What does it do to your relationship with your own professional judgment? What does it do to you to keep doing your job in the service of a decision-maker who has demonstrated repeatedly that he will not listen? Some of them, a relatively small number, a number that should perhaps have been larger, took the conclusion to its logical extreme and participated in the resistance. The conspiracy that culminated in the July 20, 1944 bomb plot against Hitler drew heavily on professional military officers who had reached exactly this conclusion. Klaus von Stauffenberg, who placed the bomb; Henning Bontresco, who was one of the conspiracy's intellectual architects; Friedrich Olbricht, who was responsible for activating the Operation Valkyrie Reserve Army mobilization that was meant to seize control of Berlin after Hitler's death. These were not marginal figures or political fanatics of another kind. They were professional soldiers, highly capable men who had served with distinction, who had looked at the strategic situation with professional clarity and concluded that the only path to any kind of tolerable future for Germany required removing the man who was driving it over the cliff. The bomb did not kill Hitler. The briefcase was moved. The table absorbed most of the blast, and what followed the failure of the plot was swift and terrible. The systematic hunting down of everyone connected to the conspiracy. The show trials conducted by the People's Court under the fanatical judge Roland Freisler. The executions by hanging with piano wire at Plötzensee prison. Hundreds of people died. And the failure of the plot removed from the field the very people who had been willing to act on their knowledge of defeat, leaving in place those who had the knowledge and the caution to do nothing with it. The tragedy of July 20th is not just the personal tragedy of the men who died. It is the institutional tragedy of what their deaths meant for the remaining course of the war, with the conspirators dead, executed, imprisoned, or driven underground. The Wehrmacht officer corps was left without its most active resistors. The remaining officers, even those who privately agreed with the conspiracy's assessment of the situation, were cowed. The surveillance intensified. The consequences of any expression of doubt became even more severe, and the army continued. Now let me come to something I find genuinely haunting. Something that I think about when I read through the prisoner of war interrogation records that the Allies compiled in 1944 and 1945, when Allied forces on the Western Front began taking large numbers of German prisoners, particularly after the breakout from Normandy and the collapse of Army Group B in the Falaise Pocket. The interrogators noticed something. Among ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, not the SS, not the party fanatics, not the committed ID, but the regular draftees who made up the overwhelming majority of the German military, there was something that the interrogation reports describe carefully and repeatedly as relief, a visible, physical relaxation, a dropping of tension, a change in the quality of the men's presence that went beyond the physical relief of being out of immediate danger. The men would talk once they understood they were not going to be executed or mistreated, and the treatment of German prisoners by American and British forces in the West was, with exceptions, notably better than the treatment of prisoners on either side in the East. They talked. Not universally. Not every prisoner opened up, but a significant proportion of them, once the initial defensiveness passed, would say things that the interrogation reports capture with a kind of cumulative force. We knew it was over. Everyone knew. We knew for a long time. We didn't say it, but we all understood. These formulations, in various forms, appear again and again across hundreds of separate interrogation reports from different units, different theaters, different social and educational backgrounds. What this tells us is something important about the gap between the soldiers, private reality, and the performance they had been required to maintain. The relief at being allowed to say what they had known, to drop the performance, to put down the weight of the unsayable, was visceral and immediate. It was the relief of people who had been carrying a secret that had cost them enormous effort to keep. Not a secret from the enemy, a secret from their own side. A secret from their own officers, their own political supervisors, their own government. The knowledge that the war was lost was, in its way, a dangerous possession, and surrendering to the Allies was, for many of these men, the first moment in years when they were allowed to own it openly. Now I want to take you to the final months. January 1945. February, March, April. By early 1945, the knowledge that the war was lost was no longer a private conclusion or a whispered understanding among soldiers who trusted each other enough to risk the words. It was a reality that the physical environment was imposing, unavoidably, on everyone in Germany. The Soviet winter offensive of January 1945. Operation Viskelodor broke through German lines on the Eastern Front with a speed and violence that was almost beyond comprehension. In 10 days, Soviet forces advanced 300 miles. Germany was no longer defending occupied territory. Germany was defending Germany. The war was in East Prussia, in Pomerania, in the eastern provinces were being fought over with a ferocity that had been building since June 1941. Since the moment German forces first crossed the Soviet border, and the people of those provinces, German civilians, women and children, and old men, farmers and teachers and shopkeepers, were experiencing what that ferocity meant for the people in its path. The refugee columns. This is what defined the final months of the war in the East. More than any military action, more than any particular battle, the columns of people moving west through the snow and the cold, pulling handcarts, pushing perambulator, carrying what they could carry and abandoning what they couldn't. East Prussia alone contributed more than 2 million refugees in the final months of the war. They moved through temperatures that dropped to -30°C. They moved along roads that were being bombed and strafed. They moved past military convoys that had priority and past military police who were simultaneously trying to maintain order and shooting deserters by the side of the road. The columns stretched 4 miles. The people in them died. Some froze. Some were killed by bombs. Some were overtaken by the advancing Soviet forces and experienced what it meant to be overtaken. German soldiers who saw those columns, who watched their own people moving in that kind of extremity, experienced something that even the most committed compartmentalization could not entirely contain. The abstract knowledge that the homeland was in danger had become concrete and immediate and human. Those were not strangers. Those were Germans. Those might be, for any given soldier, people from his own region, people who looked like his family, who carried the same possessions his family would carry if his family were in that column. And what this produced in many soldiers was a transformation from the long, grinding stoicism of the Middle War years to something raw and more desperate and, in some respects, more dangerous. A protective fury, the desperate desire to do something, anything, for the people in those columns. Even if doing something meant continuing to fight a war you knew was lost, even if it meant dying in a ditch in East Prussia in February for a cause that had no remaining rational justification, because the alternative, stepping back, surrender, allowing the front to collapse faster, felt, in that moment, like abandoning the people in the columns to whatever came next. This is not a moral vindication of continued German resistance in early 1945. The continuation of the war at that point cost immense additional lives, German and Soviet and Allied and civilian, without changing the outcome by a single degree. The war was lost. Every additional week it continued produced only additional corpses. The people who bore the primary responsibility for that continuation were the leadership, Hitler, who refused any negotiation or surrender as a matter of ideological principle, who preferred the destruction of Germany to its survival without him, who in his final weeks was issuing orders for a scorched earth policy that would have left Germany without the infrastructure for recovery. That is where the primary responsibility lies. But understanding what drove the individual soldier in his foxhole, understanding the emotional logic, the human logic that kept him there, is essential to any honest account of the war's final months. Let me tell you about something that happened in the last weeks of the war that I think crystallizes everything I have been describing. In April 1945, as the Allied forces closed in from the west and the Soviet forces closed in from the east, there were German units that were simultaneously surrendering to American forces as quickly as they could reach them and fighting ferociously against Soviet forces to their east. The same army, the same soldiers, different behavior depending on who was on the other side of the line, moving toward one surrender as quickly as possible while prolonging resistance against the other as long as possible. This was not random. This was not the product of chaos, though there was chaos. This was rational behavior within the framework I have been describing. Surrender to the Americans meant prisoner of war camps in France or England or the United States. It meant a future. It meant the possibility of going home, eventually. Surrender to the Soviets, or simply being overrun by the Soviet advance, meant something that the soldiers were not certain they could survive. The Eastern prisoner of war camps were brutal. The casualty rate among German prisoners in Soviet hands was estimated, in the early post-war period, at roughly 30%. These were numbers that filtered back, that were known, that shaped behavior. The rational calculation for a German soldier in April 1945 was to move west as fast as possible, while preventing the Soviet advance as long as possible, because the alternative, falling into Soviet hands, was a worse expected outcome than continuing to fight. This is not ideology. This is not fanaticism. This is an accurate calculation of expected outcomes, made by frightened and exhausted and rational human beings trying to navigate an impossible situation with the information available to them. And that is, in many ways, the most important insight the war's final months have to offer: the persistence of rationality even in the most extreme and degraded circumstances. The German soldier of April 1945 was not operating beyond the reach of reason. He was reasoning. He was calculating, and his calculations, given his values, his information, and his options, were producing the behaviors that the historical record shows. What I want you to take from that is this: when we try to explain the behavior of people caught in systems of catastrophe, the first explanation we should reach for is not irrationality, not ideology, not some special darkness unique to this people in this time. The first explanation we should reach for is the rational logic of a constrained situation, because that explanation, however uncomfortable it makes us, is both more accurate and more useful. More accurate because it corresponds to what the evidence actually shows. More useful because it helps us understand not just what happened then, but what can happen now. The same logic that kept German soldiers in their foxholes in April 1945 is the logic that keeps people in impossible situations everywhere. It is not unique to them. It is human. Now, finally, I want to address the moral dimension of this directly, because it cannot be avoided and it should not be avoided. The story I have been telling you, the story of soldiers who knew and continued, of men who fought from loyalty and desperation and rational calculation rather than from ideology, of human beings trapped in a terrible situation by forces larger than any of them. That story exists in constant tension with another story. The story of what those soldiers did while continuing. The story of what the Wehrmacht was involved in, not just as a backdrop or a context, but as a direct and active participant. The historical scholarship has established, beyond any reasonable dispute, that the Wehrmacht participated in crimes against humanity throughout the occupied territories of Europe. The execution of Soviet commissars under the Commissar Bethel, the order to shoot captured political officers without trial, the murder of civilians in anti-partisan operations were the formula of collective reprisals, shooting 10 or 50 or 100 civilians for every German soldier killed was applied with administrative regularity. The systematic starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, more than 3 million of whom died in German captivity. Many of them deliberately worked or starved to death in conditions that the German military authorities knew were lethal. The assistance provided to the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units of the SS, in the occupied Soviet Union, where the Wehrmacht provided logistical support, sometimes participated directly, and at minimum provided the infrastructure within which the mass killing of Jewish communities, Soviet officials, and other designated victims was possible. These were not marginal events. They were not the actions of a few exceptional units or a handful of deranged officers. They were woven into the operation of the army as an institution. They implicated enormous numbers of soldiers who were not members of the SS and who did not think of themselves as criminals. And they represent a reality that absolutely cannot be separated from the story of those soldiers' psychological experience. The compartmentalization that allowed German soldiers to keep functioning, that allowed them to separate their awareness of strategic defeat from their immediate tactical engagement, also, in many cases, allowed them to compartmentalize their own complicity, their own presence at things that should not have happened, their own silence when silence enabled things that should have been stopped. The same mechanism that preserved their military functioning also preserved their self-conception in the face of things they had seen or done or allowed. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of human psychology under extreme conditions. The same mechanism can perform multiple functions simultaneously. The compartmentalization that is a coping mechanism is also, potentially, a mechanism of moral evasion. And distinguishing between those two functions in a specific individual case may be impossible. I am not going to render a verdict. That is not the purpose of this kind of history. What I will say is that the complexity I have been describing, the human qualities of loyalty and love and rational calculation that sustained the German army in its final years, does not excuse or cancel the moral reality of what that army did. These are not alternatives. Both are true simultaneously. The soldier who fought from loyalty to his comrades was also a soldier in an army that committed crimes. The humanity of his motivation does not absolve the consequence of his continued participation. And the criminality of the institution does not erase the genuine humanity of the individual's motivation. Both are real. Both must be held simultaneously, without the comfort of reducing one to the other. That is what makes this period so important to engage with, honestly, and so resistant to the simplifications that both defenders and prosecutors of the German soldier want to apply. Let me close with something that I think matters for us, here, now. The German soldiers who knew the war was lost in 1943 and who were still fighting in 1945 were ordinary people. They were farmers and school teachers and factory workers and students and shopkeepers who had been called up by a state that commanded them and placed in a situation they had not chosen and given a job that required them to continue regardless of what they privately concluded. They were, for the most part, not monsters. They were people. And what sustained them? The love of comrades, the weight of responsibility, the rational calculation of constrained alternatives, the inertia of established behavior, the desperate protectiveness toward the people behind them. All of those things are recognizable. All of those things are, in some form, part of the repertoire of the human animal under pressure. That is what should stay with you. Not that the machinery of destruction required monsters to operate it, but that it operated, to a significant degree, through the action of ordinary human qualities: loyalty, love, responsibility, the refusal to abandon the people who depend on you, placed in the service of a system that was itself catastrophically wrong. The qualities that sustained the Wehrmacht in its final years were not qualities specific to Nazis or Germans. They were qualities that appear in every human being under sufficient pressure. The system that exploited those qualities, that constructed conditions in which those qualities led to continued participation in catastrophe, was specific. The qualities themselves were not. That is the lesson. That is the thing that the history of German soldiers in the war's final years teaches us about ourselves. Not that we are capable of becoming Nazis, but that we are capable of continuing, of sustaining the performance of a role that has lost its justification, of using our best qualities. Our love, our loyalty, our care for the specific people immediately around us to serve systems and structures and institutional imperatives that may not deserve them. The German soldiers who knew the war was lost kept fighting for 2 more years. They fought for reasons that were human and understandable, and the human and understandable reasons sustained a catastrophe that cost millions of lives. That is the truth you have to sit with. That is the truth that the history of this war refuses to let you simplify. If you want to understand how ordinary human beings function in systems of catastrophe, how knowledge of failure coexists with continued performance, how love and loyalty enable as well as resist, this is where you look. Not at the monsters, at the men who knew, at the ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, carrying their knowledge forward into the dark, doing what they could not stop doing, until finally the guns fell silent and the performance was no longer required. Remember them not with admiration, not with condemnation, but with the kind of honest, unflinching attention that history demands and that we owe to the truth of what happened. Because understanding them is not an exercise in history for its own sake. It is a preparation for the present. And if you want to keep going into these corners, the forgotten stories, the suppressed narratives, the human truths of the worst events of the modern era, then subscribe, share this with someone who needs to see it, and stay with me. There is so much more to tell. And the truth, uncomfortable as it always is worth telling. But before I let you go, there is more to this story. There are dimensions I haven't touched yet, dimensions that live in the details, in the specific accounts, in the particular experiences of particular places and particular moments, because the general truth I've been describing that German soldiers knew and continued and sustained themselves through mechanisms that were human rather than ideological needs to be grounded in specific reality if it's going to mean something beyond abstraction. So let me take you deeper. I want to talk about the Eastern Front in 1943 in a way that most accounts don't. Not the grand strategic movements, the retreat from the Don, the relief attempt at the Kursk offensive in July. Those are well documented and I want to talk about what it was like to be in a forward infantry position on the Eastern Front in the months after during the spring thaw and the summer heat and the autumn mud, as the front slowly, grinding inch by inch, moved westward. The terrain on the Eastern Front was unlike anything Western European soldiers had encountered. The sheer scale of it, distances that would swallow entire countries, landscapes without natural features, forests that went on for hundreds of miles, river systems that changed character with the seasons in ways that made every crossing a different problem, mud seasons. The Rasputitsa that turned the ground to a consistency that swallowed vehicles whole and made movement of any kind almost impossible. The Eastern Front was not a front in the conventional sense. It was an environment, and that environment, over months and years, did something specific to the soldiers who lived in it. It narrowed them. This is the word that appears again and again in the accounts, the memoirs, the diaries, the post-war testimonies. The world became very small. The world became the trench, the dugout, the 50 meters of frozen ground on either side of your position, the squad you ate with and slept alongside, the strategic picture, the vast movements of armies across continents, the political calculations in Berlin and Moscow, the negotiations and the decisions and the orders that originated somewhere far beyond your sight, that receded, not because you didn't know it was there, but because it was there, and you were here. And here was all that was real. Here was where the cold was. Here was where the food was insufficient. Here was where the dead were and the living. and the particular quality of silence that a frozen battlefield produces in the early morning before the first exchange of fire. The narrowing was protective. It was a function of the same compartmentalization I've already described, but experienced from the inside, from the perspective of the man it was happening to. You could not carry the full weight of what was happening. Nobody can. The human mind does not have that capacity. So it contracts around what is survivable, around what is manageable, around what is immediately present. And in contracting, it paradoxically enables the soldier to continue functioning as a soldier, to continue performing these specific behaviors that his role requires, while the larger reality proceeds at a distance that his mind has made bearable. There was a phrase that appears in the diaries of this period, in various forms, nor niched, nachdenken and don'think. Just don't think. Not as a command from outside, but as a discipline that soldiers imposed on themselves. A discipline of not allowing certain thoughts to complete themselves, of catching the thought that was going to lead somewhere unbearable and deflecting it before it arrived, of filling the available mental space with immediate, practical, tactical concerns, the state of the rifle, the depth of the foxhole, the direction of the wind, the sound that might mean something or might mean nothing, so that there was no space left for the thoughts that would make continuing impossible. This is a well-documented phenomenon in the psychology of combat. The literature on combat stress, from early accounts by military psychiatrists in the First World War through the extensive American research programs of the Second World War and the subsequent decades of research on veterans of Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts, consistently identifies this kind of active cognitive management as one of the primary tools of combat survival. The soldier who survives mentally in sustained combat is frequently the soldier who has learned, often without being taught, to manage the scope of his own awareness, to be fully present to what is immediately around him, to defer everything else. The German soldier on the Eastern Front in 1943 and 1944 had been in this environment, in many cases for 2 and 3 years. He had become expert at the management of his own awareness. He had built practices and habits and reflexes that kept him functional in conditions that should have broken him. And the expertise he had developed, the hard one, experiential expertise in self-management under extreme conditions, was itself a reason to continue. Because the expert at surviving in this environment is, in a sense, more capable of surviving in this environment than of doing anything else. The skills he has developed are specific. They apply here. They may not apply anywhere else. And there is something, not quite pride, not quite fear, but something in between about abandoning the domain in which you have become expert. I want to talk now about the role of the officer corps in managing the knowledge of defeat, because the experience of officers, particularly junior officers, the lieutenants and captains, who are the immediate superiors of the men I have been describing, was different in important ways from the experience of enlisted soldiers, and those differences shaped the dynamics of the small unit in ways that matter. The junior officers had, in many cases, access to more information than the enlisted men. They attended briefings that enumerated losses and replacements in a way that made the arithmetic of attrition unavoidable. They had access to maps that showed the movement of front lines in a way that the individual infantryman in his foxhole did not. They knew, often more clearly and earlier than their men, that the strategic situation was deteriorating, and they faced a specific responsibility that was not imposed on the enlisted men. The responsibility of leadership, of maintaining the confidence and effectiveness of the men under their command, of performing in their daily behavior and their attitude and their words, a degree of confidence that they may not privately have felt. This is a burden that leadership always imposes in difficult situations. The captain on the sinking ship who maintains calm, the doctor who projects competence in a crisis, the teacher who continues to teach in a failing institution. The performance of leadership in a losing situation is one of the most demanding things that any human being can be asked to do. It requires a sustained separation between the internal state and the external presentation. It requires performing confidence while knowing, projecting forward momentum while understanding that the momentum is gone. and it is exhausting. It costs something that doesn't always show in the short term but accumulates over months and years. What the historical record shows is that many German junior officers maintained this performance with remarkable consistency through much of the war's later phases. The unit histories, the testimonies of enlisted survivors, the observations of Allied interrogators who spoke to captured officers, these consistently describe junior officers who maintained morale-sustaining behaviors, who made decisions that protected their men, even when those decisions required pushing back against orders from above, who took care of the people in their immediate command in ways that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with the specific personal responsibility that leadership creates. And care, this genuine investment in the welfare of specific people, is what allowed the primary group cohesion to persist, even as the strategic situation deteriorated. The squad or platoon that had an officer who genuinely cared, who ensured the food was distributed fairly, who rotated dangerous assignments equitably, who visited the wounded, who wrote letters to the families of the dead, that unit maintained its cohesion longer and under greater pressure than units where the officer's investment in the men was more performative. The human quality of the leadership was one of the most powerful determinants of unit cohesion, and unit cohesion was one of the most powerful determinants of combat effectiveness. And combat effectiveness was what sustained the German military effort long past the point where the strategic situation could justify it. This chain of causation from the humanity of individual leaders, through unit cohesion, to sustained military effectiveness, to the prolongation of the war, is one of the most uncomfortable things to acknowledge in the entire history of the Wehrmacht's later years, because it means that the humanity was not incidental to the prolongation. It was a mechanism of it. Let me take you now to something that happened in the winter of 1944 to 1945. That, I think, is one of the most revealing episodes of the entire period. The Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, the German army launched its last major offensive on the Western Front. The plan, conceived by Hitler over the objections of most of his professional military staff, was to drive through the Ardennes, split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West before the Soviets arrived in the East. It was, by any professional military assessment, a strategic fantasy. The resources available were insufficient for the objectives. The weather on which the plan depended could not be controlled, and even complete success in the immediate operational phase would not have produced the strategic outcome the plan assumed. The professional officers knew this. They had done the calculations, the plan was presented to them as a fait accompli, and they carried it out. And yet, and this is what makes this episode remarkable, the initial phase of the offensive was successful beyond what many people expected. In the first days of the assault, the German forces drove deep into the Allied lines, creating the bulge that gave the battle its name, capturing thousands of prisoners, destroying large quantities of Allied equipment, and producing genuine alarm at Allied Supreme Headquarters. Not because the strategic fantasy had become reality, but because the soldiers executing the plan were good. They were professional. They were, within their immediate operational context, effective. They were doing what soldiers do. They were attacking, coordinating, maneuvering, fighting, and they were doing it well, in the service of a plan that most of their commanders privately believed was doomed. The episode illustrates, in concentrated form, the paradox I have been describing throughout this account. The soldiers were capable of outstanding tactical performance in the service of a strategy they knew was hopeless. Their tactical capability did not require strategic belief. It required only the specific competences and the unit cohesion that their years of experience and their small group bonds had produced. And those things they still had, right up to the end. The German army was, in a narrow tactical sense, still capable of being a formidable military force in December 1944 and January 1945. The strategic situation was hopeless. The soldiers were not, individually, hopeless. And the disconnect between those two facts is one of the most remarkable things about the war's final phase. Now I want to come to something that I think is essential and that is usually omitted from accounts of this period. The experience of German soldiers on the home front, the men who were on leave or who were in recovery from wounds, or who were in training units, or who were serving in garrison positions within Germany itself, because their experience of the knowledge of defeat was different from the experience of those at the front, and it was, in some ways, more acute. At the front, the mechanisms I have described, compartmentalization, unit cohesion, the press of immediate tactical demands, were available. At home, they were not. A wounded soldier recovering in a military hospital in a city that had been bombed repeatedly. Systematically, the city he grew up in did not have the immediate tactical demands to fill the space where strategic awareness threatened to intrude. He had time. The space. He had conversations with other wounded men, conversations that the hospital authorities tried to manage but could not entirely control. And in those conversations, the knowledge that the censors tried to contain moved with considerable freedom. The letters that German soldiers wrote home from hospitals, preserved in various archives, studied by researchers, including Robert Gellatley and Detlef Peuckart, who have written extensively about German society in the Nazi period, are among the frankiest documents the war produced. Men who were not in the immediate performance context of the front, who were protected by their status as wounded, who had perhaps concluded that the consequences of saying certain things were less immediately lethal in a hospital than in a foxhole. Those men wrote things, not always seditious, not always explicitly defeatist, but honest in a way that the front letters often could not be. And the honesty that surfaces in those documents is one of our best windows into what ordinary German people, soldiers who had been at the front, who had seen what was actually happening, actually believed by 1944. What they believed, overwhelmingly, was that the war was lost. Not all of them. Not universally. There were still men in hospitals who maintained genuine belief in German victory, who attributed the setbacks to temporary circumstances, who trusted Hitler's promises of miracle weapons and secret strategies. Those men existed, but they were, by 1944, a minority. The majority, the quiet, careful majority who chose their words with the awareness that walls had ears and that informers were real, that majority knew. And the letters contain the traces of that knowledge in every careful circumlocution, every deliberate vagueness, every formulation that says everything except the thing it means. I want to mention something specific about the psychological literature that I think is underused by historians of this period. The work on what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the discomfort that arises when a person holds two contradictory beliefs simultaneously, or when their beliefs are contradicted by their behavior, is directly relevant to what I have been describing. Leon Festinger, who developed the concept in the 1950s, argued that when people are unable to resolve cognitive dissonance by changing their beliefs or their behavior, they develop a range of strategies for managing the discomfort. They reframe the situation. They emphasize different aspects of their experience. They seek out information that confirms their existing commitments and avoid information that challenges them. They construct narratives that make their behavior consistent with their values, even when the behavior and the values are in tension. The German soldier of 1943 to 1945 was living in a state of extreme cognitive dissonance. He believed, or had been trained to believe, certain things about the war and its purposes. He was behaving in ways that his private assessment suggested were futile. He was receiving information from the front, from the letters, from what he could see with his own eyes, that contradicted the official account, and he was managing all of this moment by moment through the strategies that Festinger would later identify: the selective attention, the narrative construction, the emphasis on the local and the immediate. Understanding this is not a matter of pathologizing the soldiers. It is a matter of recognizing that what they were doing was psychologically normal. Cognitive dissonance and its management are not unusual responses to difficult situations. They are, in fact, universal features of the human mind, confronted with situations it cannot easily resolve. The German soldier was not psychologically unique. He was not operating according to some special German psychology or some special pathology produced by Nazi ideology. He was operating according to the general psychology of human beings under conditions of extreme and sustained stress, which is both a more honest account of what happened and a more disturbing one. Because if it's a general human psychology, then the question it raises is not how could they? The question it raises is, what would I do? And that question is genuinely uncomfortable. More uncomfortable, I think, than the easier question of how something so bad was perpetrated by such monsters. Monsters are simple. They exist outside the range of our identification. People are complicated. And the people on the Eastern Front in 1943, and the people in the Ardennes in 1944, and the people defending Berlin in 1945 were people. Let me take you to one final place, to the very end, to Berlin. April 1945. The Battle of Berlin was fought between late April and early May 1945. Soviet forces, numbering more than 2.5 million men, closed in on the German capital from multiple directions. Inside the city, the defenders were a patchwork, regular Wehrmacht formations, Waffen-SS units, police battalions, Volkssturm militia, composed of old men and teenage boys, Hitlerjugend units, foreign SS formations from France and the Netherlands, and other countries whose young men had signed up for the ideological cause and were now dying for it in a city that was not theirs. Hitler was in the Vorbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, issuing orders to armies that had ceased to exist, refusing all counsel to leave the city, presiding over the final days of the regime he had built. The fighting in Berlin was savage. Block by block, building by building, room by room. The Soviet forces advancing through the rubble of the city that Allied bombing and the war's own logic had reduced to fragments. The defenders fighting from basements and from behind rubble piles and from upper floors of buildings that had been partially destroyed and were being further destroyed around them as they fought. The Volkssturm men, many of them veterans of the First World War, men in their 60s who had already survived one catastrophic defeat, fighting with whatever weapons could be found, often inadequate weapons against a Soviet force that had the advantage of numbers, equipment, momentum, and the certain knowledge that the war was effectively over and they were going to win. What kept those men fighting? Not ideology, or not primarily ideology. The old men of the Volkssturm had not grown up as Nazis. For the most part, they had been middle-aged men when Hitler came to power. Men with established lives and established values. Men who had watched the Nazi period with varying degrees of enthusiasm and compliance and private skepticism. They were fighting because the Volkssturm units were organized, because there were SS men and party functionaries threatening the immediate consequences of desertion or refusal, because the city around them was being shelled and the instinct to do something in response to being attacked is very powerful, and because, in some of them, in that strange and terrible way, because the city was their city, Berlin, the city they had grown up in, that they had married in, that their children had been born in. The rubble they were crouching behind was the rubble of their neighborhood. The street they were defending was a street they had walked on their way to work for 30 years. Place attachment. It is one of the most powerful and least discussed motivators in the literature on combat motivation. The defense of a specific, known, personally meaningful place is different from the defense of an abstract strategic position. It is different in quality, different in the emotional charge it carries, different in the degree to which it can sustain effort, even in the absence of any realistic hope of success. The old men fighting in Berlin in April 1945 had no realistic hope of success. They knew the war was lost. They were not, in most cases, fanatical Nazis. But they were in their city, and their city was being destroyed around them. And the only thing they could do, the only form of agency available to them in that moment, was to resist. This is the final chapter of the story I have been telling, and it is the most concentrated expression of the paradox at its center: knowledge of defeat coexisting with continued resistance, the absence of strategic hope coexisting with tactical action, the rationale and the futile coexisting in the same human mind. In the same hour, in the same block of destroyed buildings in a city that was already, in all the ways that matter, lost. The Battle of Berlin ended on May 2, 1945. 6 days later, the German High Command signed the unconditional surrender. And the long night, the 12 years of the Nazi regime, the 6 years of the war, the years that German soldiers had spent in the mud of Russia and the sand of North Africa and the hedgerows of Normandy, and finally, the rubble of their own cities, was over. What came after is its own story. The denazification, the trials, the long, tortured, still incomplete process by which Germany has tried to reckon with what it was and what it did. That process is ongoing. It will continue to be ongoing for as long as there are people willing to do the uncomfortable work of honest examination, because the honest examination is never finished. It is never sufficient. The scale of what happened is too large for any accounting to be adequate, and the complexity of what motivated the people who were part of it is too great for any single verdict to be just. What I have tried to give you today is one piece of that examination, one honest look at one specific aspect of the war's history, the psychology of soldiers who knew the war was lost and continued anyway, not in defense of those soldiers, not in prosecution of them, but in honest engagement with the reality of what they experienced and what they did, and with the broader human truths that their experience illuminates. We are not very different from them. We would like to believe we are. We would like to believe that we would see more clearly, act more courageously, refuse more readily, stand up at the moment when standing up is required. Maybe some of us would. History suggests that the percentage who actually refuse when refusal is necessary and dangerous is smaller than most of us would like to believe, and larger than cynicism would suggest. The world is not divided into heroes and monsters, into the people who would see clearly and act correctly, and the people who would not. It is populated by people who are doing the best they can with the tools available to them in the situations they find themselves in. Tools that are always inadequate to the situation, and that are always the only things they have. The German soldiers who knew the war was lost and kept fighting were those people. They were people, and that is what history owes them. The honesty of that recognition, not absolution, not condemnation. Recognition. The recognition that they were human, which means that they were capable of the best things and the worst things, and that understanding how those things coexisted in them is essential to any serious understanding of the war, of the 20th century, and of ourselves. That is why this history matters. Not because it is comfortable. It is not. Not because it provides easy answers. It does not. But because it is true, and the truth, in the end, is the only thing worth telling. Thank you for staying with me through this. If it moved you, if it opened something, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe because the history I want to tell you is vast, and we are just getting started. There is one more dimension of this story that I haven't fully explored yet, and I want to go there, because I think it is in some ways the most important of all. I want to talk about the soldiers who broke. Not the ones who held, the ones who, at some point between 1943 and 1945, reached the end of what they could sustain and stopped, because not all of them continued. Some of them found ways to stop, and those ways are instructive. They tell us something about the boundaries of the mechanisms I have been describing, about the conditions under which the combination of compartmentalization and unit cohesion and constrained rationality finally fails to hold. Desertion from the Wehrmacht was, throughout the war, relatively rare compared to the scale of the army and the length of the conflict. The estimates vary. The Bundesreich of research suggests between 200,000 and 300,000 cases of desertion over the course of the war, from an army that at its peak numbered more than 7 million men. That is, in proportional terms, a very small number. It becomes somewhat less small when you understand the consequences of desertion, the flying courts, the execution squads, the knowledge that your family might suffer consequences for your decision, and recognize that the small proportional number reflects not the absence of the desire to desert, but the genuine and terrible effectiveness of the deterrent. But there were deserters, and studying them, who they were when they deserted, under what circumstances they deserted, tells us something important about the limits of the mechanisms that kept most soldiers in place. What the research shows is that desertion was rarely the product of an ideological decision. It was rarely the case that a soldier reasoned his way to a principled objection to the war and acted on that objection. The principled objectors existed, the few conscientious objectors who refused service entirely. Men like Franz Jiggerstetter, the Austrian farmer who refused military service on religious grounds and was executed for it in 19. But they were exceptional. The ordinary deserter was not a man who had reasoned his way to a principled position. He was a man who had broken, The typical desertion account, reconstructed from the court-martial records and the post-war testimony of survivors, involves a specific precipitating event rather than a gradual principled a loss. The death of a close comrade, particularly a close comrade who had been a primary attachment within the unit, whose death left the soldier without the specific bond that had been sustaining him. A leave that exposed the soldier to the reality of the home front, the destroyed city, the frightened family, in a way that made returning to the front emotionally unbearable. An injury that provided a temporary removal from the combat environment and allowed the deferral mechanisms to lapse long enough for the impossibility of continuation to become undeniable. A random moment of clarity, sometimes, in which the sum total of everything accumulated over years of service suddenly presented itself as a wait, that could not be carried any further. These are not principled decisions. They are human ones. They are the moments at which the machinery of continuation finally exceeds its load-bearing capacity and fails. And what is notable about them is that they are not primarily about ideology. The soldiers who broke were not, in the main, breaking because their belief in Nazism had failed. Many of them had never believed in Nazism in any intense sense. They were breaking because the specific human mechanisms that had been sustaining them, the bond with a specific person, the protective routine, the sense of being needed by someone specific, had been disrupted. Remove the bond, and the performance becomes unbearable. Remove the routine, and the deferral fails. Remove the specific person who needed you, and the reason to continue that has been sustaining you is suddenly and catastrophically absent. This is a deeply human story. It is not a story about ideology or politics or the specifics of the Nazi regime. It is a story about the limits of human endurance and about the specific conditions that push those limits in one direction or another. It is a story that repeats, with local variations, in every war that has ever been fought, in every army that has ever been sustained past the point of rational justification. I want to talk now about the experience of German soldiers who were fighting on the Eastern Front in 1944 and 1945 in the specific context of retreat, not just the strategic retreat of the front line, but the experience of retreating through territory that the Wehrmacht had occupied, through villages and towns and cities where German soldiers had lived for years, where they had established relationships, however complicated and however contaminated by the dynamics of occupation, with the local population. The retreat through the occupied territories of Eastern Europe was, for many German soldiers, an experience of a particular kind of loss that doesn't often get named in the conventional accounts. They were leaving behind places they had come to know, not as tourists, not as neutral observers, but as occupiers, which is to say, as people with a specific and problematic relationship to the landscape and its people, but also as people who had spent months and years in those places and had developed the specific attachments that come with time and proximity. A farmhouse where a soldier had spent a winter, a village square where he had stood guard on summer evenings, a river he had crossed and recrossed during the seasons of an occupation. Those places were being abandoned, and however complicated the soldier's relationship to them, the abandonment had a quality of loss that his private experience did not always allow him to name. There is something about leaving a place, especially a place you are being driven from, by an enemy you cannot stop, that has a particular psychological quality. Not quite grief, not quite defeat. Something that partakes of both, but is specific to itself. The landscape behind you is not just geography. It is the theater in which your experience has unfolded. It is the physical record of the years. And when you abandon it, when you march away from it with the enemy at your heels and the knowledge that you will not come back, something is lost that has nothing to do with strategy. The German soldiers retreating through Ukraine and Belarus and Poland in 1944 were leaving behind landscapes in which they had been complicit in terrible things. The villages where the Einsatzgruppen had operated, the fields outside towns where mass executions had taken place, the camps whose function they had known about, or suspected, or in some cases participated in supporting. The retreat forced a kind of confrontation with that landscape, a passage back through the evidence, a movement through the places where the things had happened that the advance had not required. And what soldiers experienced during that passage, what they allowed themselves to think, what they suppressed, What they saw without seeing is part of the psychological record of the war that has never been adequately examined. The silence about this in post-war German society was profound and sustained. The veterans who came home did not talk about what they had seen in the East. They did not talk about the Einsatzgruppen, or the partisan reprisals, or the prisoner camps, or the Jews they had seen and the Jews they had not seen, and what their absence had implied. The silence was not only about guilt and self-protection, though it was partly about both. It was also about the impossibility of language, about the fact that the things they had witnessed did not fit into the vocabulary of normal civilian life and could not be translated into it, about the specific damage that bearing witness to extremity does to a person's capacity to represent their own experience in words. This silence shaped the post-war period in ways that historians have been working to understand ever since. The official silence, the social silence, the family silence, the grandfathers who would not talk, the fathers who deflected the question, the collective agreement that certain things would not be examined. Those silences created gaps in the generational transmission of experience that the German reckoning with the Nazi past has been trying to fill for 8 decades, not with complete success, not with any endpoint in sight, but with a seriousness and a commitment that is, in some respects, without parallel in the history of nations that have done terrible things. Let me say something about memory, about how the soldiers who survived the war, who came home in 1945 or 1946, or in some cases years later, from Soviet prisoner of war camps, went about the work of constructing a livable relationship to what they had experienced. Memory under these circumstances is not a neutral recording device. It is a creative faculty. It selects, it arranges, it emphasizes, it suppresses. And the selections and arrangements and emphases that the veterans applied to their memories of the war were shaped by multiple pressures. The pressure of guilt, the pressure of shame, the pressure of the need to function in civilian life, the pressure of the social norms of post-war Germany, which strongly discouraged certain kinds of disclosure, the pressure of the specific relationships, wife, children, employer that civilian life imposed. What emerged from those pressures was not the truth of the war experience, but a version of it that was livable, a version from which the most unbearable elements had been removed or reframed or buried deep enough to be survivable. This is not unique to German veterans. It is characteristic of veterans of catastrophic conflicts across history and across cultures. The work of Judith Herman on trauma, of Jonathan Shea on the moral injury of combat, of David Grossman on the psychology of killing. All of this literature, developed primarily in the American context of Vietnam veterans, but applicable far more broadly, describes the same process as the selective memory, the intrusive flashback that breaks through the selection, the numbing, the hypervigilance, the difficulty of intimacy, the inability to explain, the anger that comes from nowhere, the guilt that has no addressee. The German veterans of the Second World War experienced all of these things. They experienced them in a context that added additional layers of complexity. The knowledge that what they had been part of was not just catastrophic, but criminal. Not just a military defeat, but a moral one. Not just a tragedy, but a horror. The moral dimension of the trauma was different in kind from what American veterans of conventional wars experienced. It was not "Hust I saw" terrible things. It was, for many of them, I did terrible things, or I was there when terrible things were done, or I knew and I did nothing. That is a different kind of wound. And the healing, if healing is even the right word, requires a different kind of confrontation. Some of them made that confrontation, in private, in old age, in the letters they wrote to their children and grandchildren that were sometimes only opened after their deaths. In the memoirs they began writing in the 1980s and 1990s, when the distance had grown large enough to make something like honesty possible. Some of those confrontations are among the most extraordinary documents in the entire literature of the Second World War. Not the military memoirs that recount tactics and command decisions and strategic miscalculations, but the personal reckonings, the honest ones, the ones that say, in plain language, what the soldier knew and what he did with what he knew and what he did not do with it and what he wishes he had done differently. Those documents exist. They are difficult to find and difficult to read. But they are there, and they are there because some of the men who knew the war was lost, who knew that what they were part of was wrong, who carried that knowledge through 2 years of continued service and survived. Some of those men eventually put it down. Not the weapons, those they put down in May 1945. But the silence, the performance, the constructed account, some of them eventually put that down too. And in the space where the performance had been, they left behind something that we can still read. Not as accusation, as testimony, as the honest account of what it was to be a person in that time, in tat plays with that knowledge, making those choices. That testimony deserves to be engaged with honestly, not because it makes anything better, not because it resolves anything, but because the engagement with it, the willingness to look at it with clear eyes and to follow where it leads, is one of the things that distinguishes a serious historical culture from a defensive one. It is one of the things that makes it possible to learn something from the past rather than simply to arrange the past into a shape that confirms what we already believe. The German soldiers knew for 2 years. They knew, and they continued. Understanding how, and understanding why, and understanding what that means for them, for us, for anyone who has ever been asked to continue in the face of what they know. That is the work this history calls us to do. It is not comfortable work. It was never going to be comfortable. But it is necessary, and it is ours. There is something I want to return to, something I touched on earlier that I don't think I gave enough space to, because it deserves more than a passing mention. I want to talk about the specific experience of waiting, of the long stretches between actions that made up so much of the actual texture of combat service on the Eastern Front. The image of war that most of us carry is an image of constant action. Gunfire, explosions, movement, crisis, and those elements were real, but they were not the majority of the experience. The majority of the experience, for most soldiers in most theaters, for most of the war, was waiting. Waiting in prepared positions, waiting for orders that would come down through channels that were slow and sometimes contradictory. Waiting for resupply that was delayed or insufficient, waiting in foxholes and dugouts and commandeered cellars and barns, while the cold or the heat or the rain worked on the body and the silence worked on the mind. And in the waiting, the mind worked. It could not help it. The mechanisms of deferral and compartmentalization that served so well in the heat of action were harder to sustain in the extended stillness of the waiting. The thoughts that were manageable when suppressed by immediate tactical demands became heavier in the silence. The arithmetic of the situation, the losses, the replacements, the front line on the map that kept moving west was easier to calculate when there was nothing else demanding attention. And the conclusions of that arithmetic in 1943 and 1944 and 1945 were not reassuring. This is why the diaries from this period are so revealing. A diary is the product of exactly the kind of reflective space that the waiting created. A soldier writing in his diary is doing the thing that the press of action usually prevented. Thinking, not acting. Thinking, and what he thought about what he allowed himself to write, even in the private space of a journal that might be found if he were killed and might therefore need to be tells us something that the letters, with their awareness of censorship, often do not. The diaries are more candid than the letters. Not entirely candid. Soldiers knew that diaries could be read by officers, could be captured, could be used against them, but more candid. And what they reveal is a private landscape that is often quite different from the one the official correspondence projects. Men who are exhausted, men who miss their families with an intensity that the careful language of letters barely hints at, men who have concluded, in the privacy of their own minds, things they would not say to anyone, men who are holding themselves together with a kind of deliberate, daily, self-imposed discipline that is visible in the very act of keeping the diary, the daily ritual of recording, of imposing narrative on experience, of making the day into a story that can be written down and therefore survived. The act of writing itself is significant. Writing is meaning-making, and in a situation where the strategic meaning has collapsed, where the larger narrative of the war has ceased to be one that the soldier can participate in honestly, the local meaning, the daily meaning, the meaning of this specific day recorded in this specific journal becomes a substitute, not a sufficient substitute, but something. A small assertion of order against chaos. A small claim that the experience, however terrible, can be organized into words and therefore into something that partakes of human meaning, even if it does not participate in human purpose. I want to tell you about something that happened in 1944 that illustrates the complexity of what I have been describing with particular clarity. In France, in the weeks after D-Day, as the Allied forces were attempting to expand their beachhead and the German forces were attempting to contain it, there were German units that were surrendering in circumstances that puzzled the Allied soldiers who received them. The puzzlement was this: the men surrendering were often in positions that were still militarily defensible. They had ammunition. They had weapons. They were not surrounded, or not yet surrounded. There was still a military rationale, in the narrow tactical sense, for continued resistance. And yet, they were not in large organized formations, but in small groups, sometimes a squad, sometimes a handful of men who had reached a collective decision that the thing was over. What had happened in those small groups was that the primary group cohesion, the mechanism I have described as the primary driver of continued combat performance, had been directed, in these cases, toward a different outcome. The group had decided, not one individual, not a single soldier who had broken and dragged others with him, but the group, acting collectively on a shared assessment, had concluded that the continuation of resistance served no purpose that any of them could articulate to themselves or to each other. And the group decision made possible by the same small group trust that in other cases sustained continued fighting produced surrender. This tells us something important about the mechanism of primary group cohesion. It is not inherently a mechanism for continued fighting. It is a mechanism for shared action, for the coordination of behavior within a small group of people who trust each other. In most cases, in the war's later phases, that mechanism produced continued fighting because continued fighting was the institutional default, because desertion was punished, because the group's identity was bound up with being soldiers and soldiers fight. But in some cases, in the cases where the group's assessment of the situation reached a shared conclusion that continued fighting served no articulable purpose, the same mechanism produced surrender. The trust was the same. The mechanism was the same. The outcome was different because the collective assessment was different. This means that the small group was not simply an engine of military efficiency. It was a unit of judgment. It was the level at which the individual soldier's assessment of the situation was processed through the filter of shared experience and mutual trust and translated into action. And the actions it produced were shaped by the quality of that judgment, by the information available to it, and by the specific circumstances in which it was operating. Understanding this has implications that go beyond military history. It suggests that the primary group, the small circle of people who trust each other, who have shared experience, who act together, is not just a social comfort. It is an epistemic and moral unit. It is the level at which, in practice, the largest decisions are made. Not in the abstract, not in isolation, but in the conversation between people who know each other, who trust each other's perceptions, and who are able to tell each other the truth. When that truth, when the shared, honest assessment of the situation leads to continued resistance in a losing war, it produces tragedy. When it leads to surrenders to the recognition that the thing is over and the fighting should stop, it produces something closer to sanity. The difference is not in the mechanism. It is in what the mechanism is working with, what information it has, what framework it is operating in, what the people in the group are allowed to say to each other. And this is, I think, one of the most important lessons of all. The conditions that allowed honest assessment within the small group, the conditions under which soldiers could say to each other, "This is not working, this is over." With Sahul, stop. Those conditions were systematically suppressed by the regime that was running the war. The flying courts, the informers, the consequences for defeatism, all of those instruments were aimed precisely at preventing the small group from having the honest conversation that might produce a collective decision to stop, because the regime understood, at some level, that the small group's honest judgment was a threat to continued military performance. And it was right. Where the group was allowed to judge honestly, continued performance sometimes failed. Where it was not, where the judgment was prevented by the threat of consequences, performance continued, long past the point of rational justification. This is a lesson about institutions and about the relationship between honest communication within small groups and the behavior of large organizations under stress. It is a lesson that applies far beyond the specific context of the Wehrmacht in the Second World War. Every institution that prevents honest communication within its constituent groups pays a price for that prevention. Sometimes the price is that the institution continues to pursue a failed strategy longer than it should. Sometimes the price is much higher than that. The Wehrmacht paid the highest price. It paid it in the lives of its soldiers, in the extension of the war's suffering, in the catastrophe of the final collapse. And it paid it, in part, because the mechanisms of honest communication within small groups, mechanisms that in other circumstances might have produced earlier, more rational responses to the impossibility of the strategic situation, were systematically suppressed by a regime that understood those mechanisms as threats rather than as resources. That is the story. That is the whole story. The story of men who knew and continued in a system designed to ensure that continuing was always the path of least resistance. The story of human mechanisms, loyalty, love, cohesion, compartmentalization, placed in the service of institutional continuation. The story of the small gap between private knowledge and public performance that the system worked constantly to maintain, because the maintenance of that gap was the maintenance of the war. And now, finally, it is over. The guns are silent. The last surrenders have been signed. The soldiers are walking home, or to the camps, or to nowhere, the men with nowhere to walk back to because the places they came from no longer exist in the forms they remember. The performance is finished. The knowledge they have been carrying is no longer dangerous to express. The gap between what they knew and what they were allowed to say is closing, or closed. What comes next for these men is a different kind of story. The long, private, mostly silent story of trying to live with what they know, of integrating the experience of years into the fabric of a life that has to be built again from the rubble, of answering the question that the experience poses. What do you do with the knowledge that you continued, that you kept performing a role whose justification had long since collapsed, that you sustained a system whose costs were paid by others? In the only language available, the language of the rest of the life, some of them found answers, some of them didn't. Most of them lived somewhere in between, carrying the weight with varying degrees of consciousness, putting it down in some moments and picking it up in others, shaped by it in ways they didn't always recognize and couldn't always name. Their children felt the weight without always knowing what it was. Their grandchildren have grown up in a country that has spent 8 decades trying to understand what happened and why, with a seriousness and a commitment that is genuinely without precedent in the history of nations that have done terrible things. And we, here, now, watching this video, reading these words, we are the inheritors of all of it. Of the war, of the reckoning, of the question it keeps asking in different forms across the decades. What would you have done? What do you do with what you know? When the cost of knowing and acting is very high, and the mechanisms of continuation are very powerful, and the people around you depend on your continued performance, what do? I don't have an answer that fits on a bumper sticker. I don't have an answer that makes you feel good about the human race or bad about the human race in a clean, simple way. What I have is the history, and the history says it is harder than you think. It is more human than you expect. And the question it raises about yourself, about what you would do, about what you are doing right now, in the situations in your own life where knowing and doing are in tension, that question is worth sitting with. The German soldiers who knew the war was lost 2 years before it ended kept fighting. They were people. You are people. And what connects you is not ideology or nationality or the specific circumstances of any particular historical moment. What connects you is the human condition in all its complexity and all its difficulty and all its occasional terrible beauty. That connection is why this history matters. And it is why this kind of honest, careful, uncomfortable engagement with it is one of the most important things any of us can do. Thank you for being here. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you're looking for. And share this with someone who needs to see it, because these stories are important, and they deserve an audience that takes them seriously. I'll see you next time.